The following is a Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation.
Today is another step where we can lay down the gauntlet to each other and say we're going to focus on student outcomes, we're going to focus on the future of education.
Good evening and welcome to Voice of BC. I'm Vaughn Palmer, and with just a couple of weeks to go in the month and 1 week of sitting left in the BC legislature for the spring session, a couple of members of the opposition on tonight. Kathy Corrigan from Burnaby, welcome. Thanks for being on
very much,
again.
Vaughn. Thank
and
you.
Rob Fleming, welcome back from Victoria.
Good to be here.
Good. I guess I'm going to start off by asking you, because I asked the two Liberals who were on the show last week, your reaction to the big NDP win in Alberta. Did you ever think you'd live to see it?
Well, it was a surprise, but you know, it just shows things can happen in elections. A momentum can happen in elections, and I think people of Alberta wanted a change, and Rachel Notley just really appealed to them. She's very down to earth. She's very pragmatic, and so I think she attracted a lot of people. So I mean, you have to say it was a real surprise in Alberta of all places, but obviously I'm really pleased. I think she'll do a great job.
I liked the line that your leader, John Horgan, had in the House the day after, which is he said, you know, she was a former ministerial assistant here in BC. John Horgan was a former ministerial assistant in BC. He said, ministerial assistants of the world will come. You never know what's going to happen. It is. It's kind of neat that she worked here, too, in the 90s for a while. Rob, I see the Chief of Staff to John Horgan has been loaned to Alberta, John Heaney, for a couple of months to help them on the transition. He's in for a couple of interesting months.
I think so, and John Heaney, of course, has some background in Alberta, and I think there's probably a lot of very skilled people that are going to help a government. I mean, first change in government in 44 years, such a change in the seats in Alberta's legislature, a lot of new MLAs coming in. They have to set up a government, and they have to set one up quickly. So they've got lots of people there that are, you know, and I think John Heaney is going to get some experiences there that will hopefully bode well for us when we transition to government in 2 years in 2017.
Now, the Liberals today were reminding everyone that this is the second anniversary of Christy Clark's big win in 2013, which, as you say, also means the next election is only 2 years away. So what do you guys got to get done between now and then?
Well, it's interesting because if you were to go out into the street and ask people, you know, Christy Clark is halfway through her mandate, her surprise mandate, and were to ask them to name one or two or three things that this government has accomplished in its 2 years at the midway point, they would have a hard time telling you anything. Certainly what the major promises in their campaign in the last election, none of them have come anywhere close to being true. We were supposed to have the first LNG plant up running this year. We're supposed to be on our way to cutting the provincial sales tax, all kinds of outlandish things. And instead, you know, I think this government is quite rudderless. I mean, I certainly see it sitting in the legislature, that the legislative agenda of this government is suspect. Their budget was absolutely perplexing that they tabled in February. You know, all kinds of priorities that are completely out of step with what British Columbians are thinking about. I mean, the central big ticket item in the budget was a $230 million tax cut for the top 2% of British Columbians. And in the meantime, the middle class is getting hammered by all kinds of fees, whether it's increases to MSP payments again, hydro rate increases, new fees for education, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later in the program, but it seems fees and tax hikes for middle-class people who are struggling with you know, take-home pay that's lower, and this government spent the farm on a $230 million tax cut. It's just odd, and so when I say rudderless, I really think they are rudderless.
Things do happen every day, though, and today, if you're watching us live on Thursday, the government today fired the chair of the Agricultural Land Commission, Richard Bullock. What do you make of that? Well,
I'm not entirely surprised. I think they had it in for him. I think Richard Bullock was very principled, very fair. He was a staunch defender of the agricultural land reserve, and I think in the end that's probably what did him in, is that he was not afraid to stand up to government and say, we don't think this is right. And so when we had the changes, the changes to the agricultural land reserve made by this government that made 90% of the province more vulnerable to having land removed, with the changes that the government put in, he's somebody who stood up. So I think he might be standing in their way a little bit, has been, and as a result he's been axed. I think it's very unfortunate.
He did speak out last year when the government announced they were splitting the agricultural land reserve for the first time in 40 years into 2 zones. He said he didn't think it was a good idea. And my guess is that was probably the day that he sealed his own fate as chair of the commission. He's out. Frank Leonard, former mayor of Saanich, is in. He's a good guy, out of work since losing the election last fall, but there you go. We got a lot to talk about, all on the education front. I think we should get going on some of those. So last week we had the 2 education ministers on the show, and both of them, we had questions to them from the 2 critics who are on the show tonight. So we'll see how long we can keep this going, but in any event, let's start with what Peter Fassbender said to the question Rob Fleming asked about Bill 11. Here's Peter Fassbender.
The genesis of this legislation, which I clearly articulated today in my closing comments, is to make the School Act, the Teachers Act, and the Independent School Act much more flexible, much more nimble, to meet the changing needs of education as we move forward. We are going to work with the teachers of this province, with the BCTF, with the BCSTA, the trustees, with the parents, as we move forward in developing regulations and new approaches to education. And I think the fear-mongering, quite honestly, that I heard from the other side of the House was inappropriate, because it suggests that there's some hidden motive here, which there is not.
And that was last week. It is now the law. It passed today and proclaimed into law by the Lieutenant Governor. So what do you make of it?
Well, we absolutely disagree with the government on Bill 11, but it's not just the Democrats. We have to give voice to the community out there, the education stakeholders. And, I have to say that Minister Fassbender is losing confidence of all of the major stakeholders in education. He heard very clearly from elected school trustees, school administrators, all sorts of people who, professionally have a difference of opinion on on this bill, which is really
what's the really bad part of it?
Well, I think it's moving the goalposts on the balance of powers that have been traditionally enjoyed for decades, the clear roles and responsibilities that the Ministry of Education has, and the school boards, which administer the daily operation of schools. And, a lot of people were quite cynical about it. They saw it as sort of a part 2 of the budget cuts that came for so-called administrative savings that were forced onto school boards. That was a surprise in February, because the minister had so clearly said that he would fully fund the cost of implementing the teacher's contract. He said that over and over again through what was the longest school dispute in BC history, very tumultuous time. And when it came down to the reveal on the budget, there was $55 million cut there. So now what he's doing in this legislation is essentially making it easier for him to force through administrative measures as he deems fit. And it's no wonder that school trustees are wondering, as they see the scope of their responsibilities shrink, that they have concerns because they're losing a lot of control, and there's a lot of centralization and greater ministerial powers. And I think, to use words like, this just gives us more flexibility, and the kinds of buzzwords the minister is using is completely misleading. This is new territory that we're in, and I think in the coming months and years, we will perhaps see our fears come true, which is the minister to use these powers inappropriately.
You got your start as a school trustee before you were in MLA?
Yeah, I did, yeah. So I'm always very interested in the K-12 sector as well as the post-secondary. I don't believe there's been a board in the province. Of the 60 boards, not one of them has been supportive of any part of this piece of legislation. And you have boards from all political stripes. I was up in Prince George a couple of weeks ago and met with the Board of Education from Prince George, and they were using words like non-democratic and, non-democratic and not respecting the autonomy of school boards, not respecting the co-governance model, which had there'd been a memorandum of understanding just signed in December saying we will respect each other, we will consult, we will respect the jurisdictions. School boards do best when they are given the ability to be creative and innovative. All of the best innovations, the moves forward, the best practices, they almost always come from school boards that have had the autonomy and have the professionalism. So this not only takes away a lot of that autonomy, it also doesn't respect the professionalism of teachers and of the boards and of the administrators in the district. So I think that's one of the worst things, is I don't think it's good for education. When you centralize so much, then you lose the ability to get the good ideas and the best practice that emerges usually from the boards.
We also had the Advanced Education Minister on the show last week, and there was a question from Kathy Corrigan for him, and here is his answer. Andrew Wilkinson.
We've got a situation now where adult basic education is available to individuals for free. If an individual has an income less than $23,600, they have a full grant, not only for tuition, supplies, books, but for childcare and transportation as well. A family with an income of less than $36,200 with 3 individuals, whether it's a couple with 1 child or an individual with 2 children, again, it's free. There's a 10% buffer above that, so incomes up to $26,000 and $40,000 respectively, they have half of their costs covered. And this is a comprehensive program. We've also announced just recently a special program for single parents, whether they're male or female, so they will have the same package available to them for a year. So this is a situation whereby it's simply a different payment vehicle for the same service. And so the idea that adult basic education is no longer available without charge is just plain wrong.
That sounds like a pretty good deal the way he tells it.
Well, since 2007, the government has made the decision, and rightly so. The Campus 2020 report said it is in the best interest of this province for adult basic education, where people either want to finish their high school, either in the school system as adults going back, or in the post-secondary system, where people who wanted to do that or wanted to upgrade so that they could go back and become a nurse or whatever, that they needed to take a course or two, that they could do that for free. And it was recognized by everybody, this government included, that it was in the best interest of British Columbia. So now what has happened is the government has changed the rules, and it said, yes, you can complete your dogwood, you complete your high school for free, but if you want to upgrade, you're going to have to pay for that. If you want to complete or finish your high school or upgrade your high school in the post-secondary system, you have to pay for that. So no grants available for that. So there are grants available, sorry, but you're going to have to pay for that unless you're below that
thresholds.
Before that threshold. The result is, here's the result. Whatever the minister might say, it's hard. It's hard to get those grants. Not everybody's eligible. That's going to be an administrative nightmare for the colleges and universities to try to help people. But here's the bottom line, Vaughn. What has happened is that the doors are closing. Yeah. The doors are closing. So you have whole institutions like Vancouver School Board's downtown East campus is closing down. A couple of their other campuses are closing. The outreach programs are closing. That is true all over the province, and the post-secondary courses are being severely reduced. So whatever the minister might want to say about it's fine, the reality is that the budgets have gone down, the access has decreased, and far less people are going to be completing or upgrading their high school as a result of the changes that have taken place.
David Schreck with a question for Rob Fleming.
Rob, Premier Clark frequently points to her negotiated settlement with the BCTF as one of her biggest accomplishments. If the NDP were in power, would you have the strength to put on enough pressure to get a settlement with the BCTF, or would you have to resort to legislation?
I think that we would undoubtedly have tough negotiations with the BCTF. There's no question about it, because the two parties, when they sit down, will have different opinions about different matters. I think what's so frustrating, though, about what became the longest school shutdown in BC history is that we had the government continuing to act as if they were bargaining. They were not at the table. We had mixed messages through the summer that Vince Reddy was not available or mediation couldn't proceed. And then lo and behold, after a 3-week shutdown in September, after we'd had 2 weeks lost at the previous school year, Vince Reddy was able to get a deal. He was able to put the government, runaway train back on the track and get our kids finally back in school. I mean, they were really at the brink of disaster point as we headed towards October. And Christy Clark likes to talk about this as a success. Nobody who went through that experience, either the 550,000 kids or their parents or the families that are involved in those children, considered that a good moment in this government's record. And I have to laugh too. I mean, since that time, since that agreement was announced, the thanks that Vince Reddy gets for helping this government avert disaster is that he's airbrushed out of the photo ops. You never hear about him anymore. Now it's, some kind of achievement of the Premier. That's not an achievement. It has created acrimony. It has unfortunately shaken the confidence that people have and ought to have in public education. And I think we're going to pay the price for a long time for the confrontation that this government pursued.
Government won a round with the this interminable court battle in the Court of Appeal a few weeks ago. Do you sort of assume that's going to go to the Supreme Court of Canada and we'll hear when we hear how this comes out?
I think it probably will. I mean, you could have much more qualified legal guests than myself, but given that there's critical constitutional issues that the Supreme Court of Canada has been interested in, namely freedom of association, collective bargaining type arguments. This government alone has referred a lot of cases that made it all the way to the Supreme Court and were deemed of national significance to test the Constitution. So, and it was also a split decision. So I think if you look at the minority opinion of Justice Donald in this BC Court of Appeal decision, there will be some legal issues that I would suspect the Supreme Court of Canada might be interested in.
I am not a lawyer either, but I also see a lot of suggestion that the High Court might take it because of the unusual Court of Appeal second-guessing trial judge on who heard all the evidence. And that's one of the things that Donald pointed out. So no bets on that one, except, it'll probably be another year or 18 months before we know where it comes out. For the Advanced Education Minister, we have a question from Paul Ramsey, a former Minister of Advanced Education. Here he is.
The government has announced with great fanfare that it's going to re-engineer post-secondary education in British Columbia. When I talk to my former colleagues in colleges and universities in the province, they're not sure what the heck that means, even now, a year or so after it was announced. Can anybody tell me what exactly is going to happen in our new re-engineered universities and colleges that's not happening now?
Well, having promoted you to a minister, I guess I better let you do the answer.
Thank you. Does that mean I have to defend it now? Vaughn, he's talking about the blueprint for education.
Yeah.
And it was announced a little over a year ago. And I think the bottom line is what government has said it's going to be is a realignment of dollars to areas that line up with jobs that we need to fill in the future. And on the face of it, there's pros and there's cons. So the concern is that it's going to create upheaval in our system. And we've had a lot of upheaval. We've had budget cuts. We've had $50 million coming out of the system over the last 2 years alone, and that's after years and years of cuts. So the post-secondary system is one system which actually has seen cuts as opposed to just being flatlined and not being able to keep up with their rising costs. So there's a huge problems. And when you add on top of that, government saying no new dollars, we're going to move to 25% of the dollars being aligned in certain areas that we think are important, that creates upheaval and uncertainty. Absolutely, for sure, uncertainty. But it's also one of the problems with it. A lot of the realignment is being done because of LNG, the promise of LNG. So you're having all these jobs that seem to be as these 60 jobs that we want to have the training for, many of which are there because of the promise of LNG, and we don't know what's going to happen with LNG. So you're all this upheaval in order to satisfy at least partly the LNG jobs. So there's a concern about that, and it also means that some colleges and universities are definitely going to win, some aren't. There are concerns about the liberal arts type of education, you know, one of the top jobs that's in that top 60 jobs that we're supposed to be training for is, the top job is administrative assistant. The number 2 job is administrator. There's no training that can be aligned with that. And so there's no dollars going to that. That would usually be somebody who is a critical thinker, might have come out of a general arts or general science degree at a university, but there'll be no alignment for that. So it's skewing in favor of the types of jobs that are very specific and concrete. And there's all these jobs that do prepare people for the future, prepare our leaders that are not going to be getting credit, and the money will be going away. And this is also at the same time, it's not entirely related to the blueprint, but at the same time with the budget cuts, what you're finding is that all sorts of programs now are being shut down as well. So I was saying that I was up in Prince George a couple of weeks ago.
I'll come back to Prince George. We'll take a brief break on Voice of BC with the 2 education critics, 2 education ministers, as I probably will call them again. Stay with us.
You know, we are committed to Bill 11. Mr. Fleming is dead wrong on a couple of points. There has been consultation for the last 2 years since I've been minister. This government is committed to transforming education and what it's going to take to do that.
Creating local TV that matters to your community. Shaw TV, your local voice.
Did you know Voice of BC is now on Facebook? Go to facebook.com/VOBC on Shaw TV to check out our video clip library, post a message on our wall, or click the link to view our past episodes archive.
Hi, I'm Ella. The warmth has been with me my whole life, ever since I was a baby. I've grown a lot since then, and they've made sure that I always have the devices I need to try new things. I can do anything. The Ramps is there to help me be me. Ta-da!
Did you know that Voice of BC has its own YouTube channel? Just go to youtube.com/Voice of BC. Here you will find hundreds of short video snapshots taken from past episodes of Voice of BC, organized into different categories for easy searching. Check us out and let us know what you think.
Students paying some share of their post-secondary cost through debt and through tuition is good because it incentivizes students to focus on programs where they're going to have a future and they're going to have employment. So I'm not sure that high student debt is an issue that the NDP can win on in the next election.
And welcome back to Voice of BC. And when we went away, we were headed for Prince George with Kathy Corrigan. Tell me about it.
Second time we're headed for Prince George. I was talking about the pressures on post-secondary institutions, and UNBC and the College of New Caledonia are 2 examples of that. So College of New Caledonia is cutting programs right now. They're cutting their dental assistant dental hygiene program. Bit of a reprieve now, but they're in trouble. And those are high-cost programs. So one of the impacts of the blueprint that I was talking about before is with the reshuffling of the dollars, is that the institutions are making decisions about cutting programs that don't necessarily have to do with what is good for the community, what are good jobs. 97% of those students got jobs. The dentists are saying we need them. They're wanted in the community and in the north, and there's people staying in the north as a result of having those programs. But what's happening is that program is closing, and the reason that it's closing is because it's an expensive program, so decisions are being made not on the basis of whether they're good programs, appropriate programs, useful programs, but on the basis of money, and money alone. And that's one of the impacts, partially of the blueprint, partly on the cuts to post-secondary education.
Rob Fleming, tell me the issue with school buses. This came up a couple of times during the session and question period. My colleague Rob Shaw did a story in The Sun on it. What's the issue?
Well, I think the issue that's shocking to parents is that school bus service is where it exists in rural and typically suburban communities where you have a significant commute for a student to get to the front door of their school and to get home safely, is typically free or of a very nominal fee. And now we're starting to see fees proposed next year of, in some cases, $500 or $700 if your family has 2 school-aged children. Like a real hit in the wallet, especially for a parent that has to worry about team fees and back to school supplies, and there's a lot of fees that are being levied by the school districts as well for other things. So it's a big chunk of change.
People thought it was, they didn't realize it was optional under the government would let them do this, but they are letting them do it.
That's right, because it's considered administrative savings in terms of the funding envelope.
This is low-hanging fruit.
This is low-hanging fruit. Having your kid delivered safely to school and home every day is now considered low-hanging fruit. So, in places like Chilliwack and Abbotsford, there's a big concern. Parents are really upset about this. They can't afford it, and secondly, they worry about how this is going to impact their lives. A lot of parents, obviously, two working parents, they have significant commutes to and from work themselves. They need the school bus service. Another district is dealing with it in a different way. That's Maple Ridge. They're proposing to cancel bus service altogether by 2016. Now, that's a busy, fast-growing population where you have students, it's a long commute in some cases for people who live in Maple Ridge. And
so $500 a year is one of the services they're talking about?
That's right. And you've got it way up north in the Northeast as well, and I'm surprised I haven't heard any Liberal MLAs anywhere that represent any of these seats say a word about it, not from Fraser Valley Liberals or any of those in the Peace area. And this is where it's happening. Now, I expect we'll hear even more about school bus fees and others.
In the fall.
Yeah.
When it hits people.
When it hits people.
When it hits people, they'll be shocked.
My colleague Andrew McLeod from the Press Gallery, works for the Tyee, has written a book about economic inequality in British Columbia. In fact, he was on the show talking about it a few weeks ago. He has a question for the 2 education critics on that subject. Here is Andrew.
Education is often held out as a solution to inequality, but over the past few decades, as we've become a more educated population than we ever have been, we've also seen inequality rise. I'm wondering what else you think is needed.
You read his book?
No, I haven't.
Pick it up.
Okay, I will. I didn't even know he'd written a book. So it's absolutely clear that when people get an education, a post-secondary education, that their chances in life, their economic chances in life, their chances to get jobs, to make a good living for themselves and their families improve. So to me, the most important thing that we can do is invest in our public education system, K-12 or post-secondary. It is the best route for getting people out of poverty. And so when I see the government cutting adult basic education, cutting English language programs, which is another part which is really almost tied to the adult basic education, which is going to mean thousands and thousands of students are not going to have those pathways. I think it's very short-sighted when we're talking about wanting to try to improve the job prospects for British Columbians. Part of the group that we're relying on are people that traditionally have had barriers and that we're trying to remove. Immigrants, they come with all sorts of credentials, and all they need in many cases is just a little bit of getting over a hurdle of their language. And we've had those classes for years now, and they've been very successful. And what you also find is when they do it in the colleges and in the universities, largely in the colleges, is that they go on. Well more than half of them, sort of 2/3 to 3/4 of those students go on, and they take other post-secondary courses in healthcare, in all sorts of different technical fields, or go on to university. So it seems very short-sighted to cut off that entry point, make it harder. Even if you can still do it, it's harder. And as I said earlier, with both ELL, English language courses, and with the adult education, the result is that we are having thousands of less students going into our colleges and universities, and those thousands less are going to translate into less that go on and take other training.
Bruce Halser with a tough question for Kathy Corrigan. Here's Bruce.
Average post-secondary student debt in BC is $27,000, which is about what somebody would borrow to buy a really nice new car. I think that's a really good investment in somebody's future. $27,000 doesn't seem to me to be an outrageous debt to carry, to have an education where you're going to have a good job and contribute to the economy and make a substantial income.
Good deal.
Well, there is no doubt that people come out of post-secondary, I've just said it, that they will do better in life, but the reality is it's just another barrier as you put more barriers in the way. And I'm not suggesting that people should not be paying for at least part of their own education. There are countries in the world where they don't, and the education levels are phenomenal and the success is phenomenal. But what you want to make sure is that you have access. The people I worry about are not people like Rob and I who came from middle-class families. The people I worry about are the growing number of students and families who are seeing post-secondary education as being unattainable. It's taking people longer to go through. There are people who are simply not doing it, and I talked about that some of those people just a few minutes ago. It is becoming more difficult. Students are coming out with a bigger debt, and what you're finding more and more is that it works okay for those of us that come from middle class or upper middle class families. Certainly those families that just got a big tax break are doing just fine and can send their kids and help their kids. But it's for the rest, it's for the rest of the middle class, those that are struggling, and certainly those kids that come from homes that aren't doing particularly well financially. They're not going to school as much as they could.
And Bruce Halser with a tough question for Rob Fleming. Here's Bruce.
Education spending in the last 10 years has gone up more than 25%. After inflation, it's about 5% of a real increase. When you take into the fact that we have less students, it's about a 40% increase. So it is true that, as the NDP says, that other provinces have had even bigger spending increases on education. And in some sense, it's true that we haven't kept pace with the education spending increase in Alberta or Ontario in the same period. But so what? On standardized tests, our kids perform better than any other province, and they're one of the best in the Western world. The measure of how our system is doing should be performance, and if we're getting that performance without spending as much in Alberta, I think that's a good thing. And I think the NDP is going to have trouble convincing British Columbians that it's a bad thing.
What do you think?
I think what he's missing, and I don't know if Bruce is a parent or not, but what has got to be one of the clunkiest terms ever, but is now commonly understood by parents after Christy Clark's disastrous school shutdown, is the idea around class size and composition. There are too many classrooms in BC where you have a lot of kids who have special learning needs that aren't being addressed. You have a lot of classes well over either the guidelines or caps that used to be in place on class size. And that is a key indicator for a lot of parents around quality and whether their kid is being given the attention that they need to be successful. That comes from, in many cases, staff shortages. It was interesting to see that the 2015 data just became available on class size composition. It was supposed to be addressed by the education fund that was negotiated by the BCTF with the government, and it showed that there was absolutely no improvement over 2014, and that was the worst year over the last decade for class size and composition being out of compliance.
Where does the money go, do you know?
Well, I think what's happening is that you've got the government that promised to fully fund the teacher settlement, then taking back a significant portion of it in administrative savings cuts. So teachers that are being hired, you have an equivalent amount being laid off. So the net increase in teaching staff to be able to address some of the problems that we've been experiencing in different districts, and it's experienced differently whether you're in a fast-growing district or one that has an enrollment decline. But it hasn't been significant enough to be able to make improvements. So long term, too, I think, Bruce may not want to listen to the New Democratic's perspective on this, but he should listen to organizations like the Conference Board of Canada. There are a lot of business organizations, the STEM movement around science and technology education that are saying British Columbia cannot afford to be complacent. You are actually starting to see BC test scores, although they are very high, dropping relative to our competitors. And I think one of the problems with the BC Liberals is that they inherited a very good, very strong public education system, and they've been very complacent administering over it. They don't have a vision for how to improve it, and our long-term success as a prosperous province relies on having strong outcomes from the public education sector to go on to advanced education and to create jobs in a high-value economy.
Talked
I
a bit
think-
about
oh,
this.
sorry.
Well, we've talked a bit about this issue already, but I want to get back onto it because it's certainly something you hear from parents, and I have another question for Kathy Corrigan later. But let's go to Jordan Bateman, Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Here's Jordan.
I think a lot of parents buy into the BC Teachers Federation's contention that public schools are unfunded because we're being asked to pay for so many things that should be the responsibility of the school. We have to bring reams of paper, we have to bring Kleenex boxes. We're constantly paying into various funds and fundraising to try to provide different supplies for the students. Is this sustainable when so many families are struggling to make ends meet? Can we go on with this kind of nickel and diming of parents?
You thought it was going to be about the transit plebiscite.
I wondered. Well, I think Jordan actually brings up a very good point. I mean, we've seen a ridiculous number of fees levied by certain districts, and not to single any of them out, but I mean, there's even one for an earthquake preparedness fee. You know, so you've got, you know, school annual fees, locker fees, and on it goes. And now we have significant things like the school buses. We've talked about that.
What does the earthquake preparedness
That's a very good question,
fee
Vaughn. I'm not
buy
even
you?
sure about
They
that.
probably have a kiosk that they're fundraising for, maybe, eh? Do you
I
think
think
so?
it's probably emergency packs and
Yeah, I would
classrooms
think
and those
so,
sorts
yeah.
of things.
Yeah.
But
Since we are, as I remind people, in one of the least seismically safe buildings in British Columbia right here tonight doing this, this is a
right.
matter of more than academic interest to me. But anyway, thank you. Sorry to interrupt. I do have a question for Kathy Corrigan, and it is about, this is a good question. BC Business Council, Jock Finlayson, here he is.
Sometimes overlooked in discussions of post-secondary education is that we have a fairly large private post-secondary system in BC. There's up to 300 institutions of one sort or another, and there's some 60,000 students who are enrolled in private post-secondary education and training programs. There's been some controversy over the past number of years about the quality of some of these institutions, and there is, I think, a desire in many quarters to ensure that we maintain a strong brand in BC for excellence in post-secondary education. So government does have a role to play in ensuring the quality of that part of the post-secondary system as well.
You got any sense of how closely the government is watching it and whether it's close enough?
It hasn't, there's been a lot of problems, or there's been some problems over the years. We just have gone through the Private Training Act, the new act. Yes. Unfortunately, it was a terrible piece of legislation. The validators that the government had from their advisory board, over the time they were putting the legislation together, they couldn't get even any of them, once the legislation came out, to say this is a good piece of legislation. It leaves a lot of the problems. It leaves a lot of the problems that were already there. For example, with language schools, leaves huge loopholes for the language schools, and is very, very vague. So absolutely zero support from the whole private education sector, which is really, really unfortunate. It's just a backwards piece of legislation, all regulation, and nobody knows where it's going to go. Real concern in the sector. I've been visiting some of the private training schools, and I think there is certainly a spot. Certainly, some of the international language schools are very successful. They're great for our economy, and some of the other private schools, private training schools, they are important. They form a real function that is different than our public education schools. But I think what we always have to remember is that we need to make sure that we support our public education schools. They're generally more accessible. They are they're well regulated. We need to regulate the private education as well. And what is going to be interesting in the future, Vaughn, is I think we're going to see more of a transition between the two. There's going to be more going back and forth between the two. For example, now you have private schools that have pathway agreements with public institutions, some of our universities and colleges, where students come in and they do training in language mostly, and then they have a pathway into the universities. We've got to be, it's not a bad idea, but you've got to be really careful how you monitor that as well to make sure that it's well regulated.
Take a brief break with the two education critics on Voice of BC. Stay with us, we'll be right back.
British Columbia is the only province in Canada where if you want to know what's going on in the education system, you should look up the court cases at Supreme Court, Appeal Court, even the Supreme Court of Canada. It's a sad commentary on British Columbia.
We're there to bring it home. Shaw TV, your local voice.
Missed something on Voice of BC? Check us out online by Googling Voice of BC on Shaw TV, where you can watch this show or past episodes of Voice of BC. And of course, you can always catch an encore presentation on your local Shaw TV. In the Lower Mainland, watch on Saturday afternoon at 1 or Sunday at 2 p.m. On Vancouver Island, we're on at 10 a.m. on Saturday and Sunday afternoon at 2. For all other parts of the province, contact your local Shaw TV or check the TV listings for your area.
You might think it's okay to check your email at a stop sign.
But you're wrong. A crash can happen in an instant. Every second counts when you're driving.
Join us in taking the challenge and leave your phone alone.
There are more ways to connect with us at Voice of BC. Follow us on Twitter at Voice of BC. Send us an email to vobc@shaw.ca or write to us at 111 1925 Blanchard Street, Victoria, BC, V8T 4J2.
Kathy, I can't believe I'm saying this, but your husband Derek has been amazing on the TransLink file. I only wish he and I could have convinced you and the other members of the official opposition to actually oppose TransLink's wasteful record and vote no.
Had to happen.
I knew he was going to get back to that. Yeah, he goes on. By the way, I think tomorrow, if you're watching us on Thursday, is your last day to request a balloting package for the transit plebiscite. You've still got to the end of the month to get your ballot in. Turnout's pretty good, 40%. That's pretty good for an election in British Columbia. And I'm told by Elections BC that on the HST referendum, half the ballots came in the last week. So we could be in for a pretty high turnout on that. You can go on the Elections BC website and find out what you need to know about it. And of course, as we always say, elections are decided by people who vote, not by people who talk about it. So there you go. Let's go back, and we've got a good question from the University of Victoria from Jamie Lawson about school boards. Here he is.
In a number of ways, Bill 11 seems to be increasing central control throughout the province over a number of important matters having to do with K through 12 education. And we could debate back and forth about the particulars on that, data sharing and so on. But it seems to me it may be worth restating what the continuing value of having this separate level of elected school boards really is, given the current trends in more centralized direction to the education system. Can you clarify for us what the vision is about the importance in an ongoing way of elected school boards in the different regions?
So as I recall, the NDP government in the 90s, it was one of the most painful things for New Democrats that they did, which is they reduced the number of school boards in the province. It was
Yes,
a tough fight.
Yes, we did, on the basis of a commission, and I think it was a transparent process.
Do you think that's what the Liberals are up to now?
I'm not sure about that, and we've certainly had them on the record where they've categorically denied that, so we'll hold them to that if they go there. But I think Jamie's point, what is the role going to look like in a post-Bill 11 world? I mean, there's no question that school boards can be overruled, even fired by the minister on a whim now. And that's kind of dangerous territory, especially we've already talked about what happened to the Agricultural Land Commission chairman this week. So I think they may well use that power, which was only previously to be used in extremely rare cases where they, a board failed to live up to their fiduciary responsibilities. But why I think it's dangerous is that I don't think the Ministry of Education, I don't think the BC Liberal government has an idea of why they're doing this, why they're centralizing more and more functions potentially into the Ministry of Education. There's no capacity there, for example, to lead on professional development. We have, a profession that works closely with boards to look at regional priorities as to what kind of professional development issues are most needed. If you have a population that is multicultural and has English language learning issues, for example. Professional development looks different there than in a part of northern rural British Columbia, or an area where there may be behavioral issues in a classroom where there are special needs learners. Those are the kinds of things that are school determined and have been best left to districts and teachers to collaborate on. But what I think Jamie's point, the best point he's making here, is that the government's gone ahead and rewritten something here, and I think what concerns me is that where you see the bright spots and the innovation happening in public education in BC, whether it's trades training up in the northeast of BC, or whether it's excellence in the arts, or whether it's certain types of academy programs right here in my own district in Greater Victoria, those ideas come to fruition at the local level. That's where they're developed, working in concert with parents, and it's a responsive government. Local government looks at the needs and the interests of their area, and it's the ministry that comes and learns from them, not the other way around.
Exactly.
So I think the top-down approach is going to be a failure.
Yeah,
and then they
I
come
agree.
along and tell you to pick the low-hanging fruit. Steve Cardwell was the school superintendent in Vancouver, and he's now moved on to the University of British Columbia, and a couple of times we've used him to tape questions on the show, and he always comes up with thoughtful questions. Here he is, Steve Cardwell.
A recent report commissioned by the BC Council for International Education, written by Rosalind Kunin and Associates, indicates that international education is a great contributor to the BC economy. In fact, I believe the contribution is close to $1.5 billion, just a little behind logging and forestry industry. This is huge for BC. I note as well that the Premier has expressed a desire, a direction to increase the number of international students in both K-12 and post-secondary for this province. I'm wondering, in terms of your mandate, how you see this unfolding. Do you see this as a competition for available seats for domestic students? And I think in terms of the growing economy, how do we encourage more international students to come to British Columbia?
I had no idea it was that ambitious.
Yeah, it's it can be an economic driver. It is. These schools that I've gone to visit in Vancouver and other areas, these students bring in thousands and thousands of dollars, and they go
this
from...
This is both university and K-12, right?
And K-12, absolutely.
Yeah.
But also the private institutions.
Right.
So the language schools, they bring in their language tourists, they call them. So it's international students coming in and wanting to learn English, coming and staying for 6 months or a year sometimes. And then some of them go on to post-secondary, and some of them go home. So it is a big economic driver, and it's positive. But I think what you have to do is you have to say, what is the purpose of our post-secondary system? So that's fine, but if colleges and universities are coming to rely on them, as they increasingly are, as the percentage of funding goes down, the percentage of the funding for universities decreases, the provincial money, the public money decreases, colleges and universities are being forced to come up with other things. So more international students.
Because the visitors pay more. They pay a premium.
They pay a big premium. They pay a big premium. And that is fine, Vaughn, as long as what you are doing at the same time is that you are protecting the system to have integrity and also to make sure that it serves domestic students. And those are the two tests. So if you can do that, that's fine. I know that some have expressed concern that if you have more and more international students, that at some point that has to have an effect, or could have an effect, on the number of domestic students and the access. And I don't think anybody wants that. So you have to watch out for that. You also have to watch out for the quality of the system and make sure, because what I've heard, and many, many different sources, is that as you have more and more international students coming in, there is a real pressure. This becomes a product that they are purchasing. They are clients now. And there are certain demands that go along with being clients. It's a different kind of approach to education. So that there is pressure on institutions, a lot of pressure at times, to say, okay, I'm buying a product, I want the mark, I want this service, and so on. And so then the pressure there is to make sure that you keep the integrity of the system, because what they're buying is excellence, and we all want to make sure that we keep the excellence.
K-12, some school districts supplementing their income this way as well, and to a significant degree?
Some are. Richmond, West Vancouver, Vancouver do very well. Surprisingly, a couple places in the interior, Kamloops is very good at this. I think, though, the government has a misplaced emphasis on how this can replace revenue that is lost in BC declining to 9th place in Canada in per pupil funding. So, it doesn't fix that problem. It also does give, some resentments, because the opportunities for Prince Rupert, for example, are not the same to attract international students as some of the Metro Vancouver areas or a place like the South Island. However, I mean, it's largely a good, and I think one of the economic benefits, just like it is for international students in post-secondary education, is that these students have a wonderful experience in British Columbia. They become familiar with a part of the world known as Canada. They may go back to their host countries or to another country and gain more education, but they may create long-term, lifelong relationships with the province of BC.
Or
so
they move
these,
here.
yes,
They may
exactly.
stay here.
So they're
They may stay
harder.
here.
These are less tangible, but I think they can be quantified as well.
Well, we had Jordan Bateman soften her up on this issue, and now we've got bringing in the big guns, Bill Tillman, to give Kathy Corrigan a hard time about her husband, Derek Corrigan, the mayor of Burnaby, and Kathy Corrigan being on different sides on the transit plebiscite. Here's Bill Tillman.
Kathy, it's not your portfolio, but you're publicly on the record as disagreeing with your husband, Burnaby Mayor Derek Corrigan, on the transit plebiscite. Do you have a prediction on which side will win?
Oh, man.
We must have fabulous discussions.
Well, I got to say, we disagree so often, but it's very friendly discussions, and I think it makes both of us sharper, probably, because we have to deal with each other. Do I have a prediction? No, I don't. I mean, the turnout, I know that the yes side has been really working hard. Frankly, it probably has more money and more people out. There are more people that are invested in the yes side than there is in the no. That doesn't mean the vote is going to end up that way. But, yes, we've come from different perspectives on this, but I think we're pretty representative. I think there's been a lot of discussion in a lot of living rooms around the Lower Mainland, because there are competing things. A lot of people are really choked, and rightfully so. Derek does not like TransLink. He thinks it's undemocratic. The provincial government did that. It was a bad move. This has been foisted on us. It's a ridiculous referendum. Nobody asked for it. And at the end of the day, he can't support it because of the history of TransLink. He is very concerned and thinks it's a bad plan.
That's his case. What's yours?
That's his case. On the other side, those of us who are supporting say, we want more transit. We have to have it. Economically, it's the right thing to do. We need the transit, and so if we were in government in a couple of years, we would be really pleased to be able to invest in transit. So that would be support for that, and so we say, give us a chance to fix it in a couple of years.
You hear that, Derek?
He's heard me say it many times.
We've got a few questions left to go, a little bit of time, from the University of Victoria, political science. This is a woman who's a student of Jamie Lawson's, Susan Kim. Here she is.
Given the recent campaign at the University of Victoria called Divest GVEC, where they're lobbying the administration to divest their resources from banks and businesses involved in oil, I'm wondering why that we even need a campaign if the universities should be publicly funded and are publicly funded.
Interesting how this one spills over with public sector pensions too, which are invested in the same thing. What's your view on the universities on this one?
Well, I think it's ambitious, and
you mean divestiture is ambitious?
Yeah. I think it's very ambitious to suggest that can be done. It's difficult. I mean, any part of our life to suggest that we're going to move away from something. I think it's a real challenge. But I appreciate the sentiment. But there is a fiduciary duty that universities have. So.
Yeah, and there's a similar, and George Heyman, who was the head of the BC Government Service Employees Union, was on the show a while ago, and he pointed out that there's the same with the pension funds, right?
Yeah.
The trustees of the pension funds, who are appointed by the unions as well as by the government, have a duty to maximize returns, and
Yeah.
Fossil fuel companies are strangely profitable, and I don't know how they manage to do that.
But you can have ethical funds. You can have ethical funds, and as long as that fiduciary duty is being met, then you can have ethical funds.
Head of the BC Teachers Federation with a good question, Jim Eicher. Here he is.
For years, BC teachers have been working to get specific anti-homophobia policies passed in all 60 school districts. These policies ensure that BC schools are safe places for LGBTQ students, staff, and their families. But there are still 22 school districts who have not passed such a policy. The government, despite promoting Pink Shirt Day, has done nothing to force school boards to comply, even as the minister expands his own powers to issue directives under Bill 11. Why do you think successive BC Liberal ministers of education have not spoken out against school boards who refuse to pass anti-homophobia policies?
And I heard one of your critics in the legislature today, Rob Fleming, Spencer Chandler Herbert, asking about this and pointing out that British Columbia has refused to do something that Alberta did under the Alberta Conservative government.
Yeah, and that Ontario has done under a Liberal government. No, I think BC is lagging behind other jurisdictions that have looked at how you create equal access throughout a provincial jurisdiction to safe spaces for LGBT youth. This is one of the most challenging things for a young person in their high school life, and the support networks are crucial to getting through that. I think what we see typically from the minister is he'll say, oh, there's a wonderful program over here, and it's interesting that as he's moved to standardize and centralize so many things, and I think Jim was making this point with regards to administration of school boards, suddenly he defends the rights of autonomy and different approaches at the local level on this issue. So, no, I think a standardized approach is needed in British Columbia. I like the legislation in Alberta. From what I understand is that in any school where a group of young people come together and request what's called an alliance club to be created, the district must help do that, and that's a provincially mandated law now. And I think BC would be well served. It's apparently working very well in Alberta. I'm sure there was some controversy when it was introduced, although I'm surprised it had all-party support. And I think that Alberta, again, can teach us a lesson on this issue for sure.
What would an alliance club do?
Well, it would create a safe space for students to get together and to talk about issues around their sexual identity, and to be able to basically have a supported, identifiable part of the school, and to have a presence there. And I think that's how they work.
It's interesting, too, because you pointed out the BC government has led an anti-bullying thing. It would seem to fit into that, but there you go. It
certainly should, yes.
Time for one more question. Yes, we do. From Camosun College, Janice Simcoe. Here she is.
Since the Aboriginal Service Plan came into place at Camosun College, we have more than doubled the number of Aboriginal students that are attending the college, and we're seeing far more students being in post-secondary programs than are doing upgrading programs. There's great success out of this initiative.
We do more on that one? Can we build off that program at Camosun? Is that something we should be doing?
I think that colleges and universities across the province are coming up with innovative programs to support Aboriginal students. But I actually think you have to start, we have to do a lot better at the K-12 level as well. So we've got a long way to go in this province. In some districts, the graduation rates are improving. And there was a lot of emphasis on this a few years ago, but in some districts, Rob would know better than I do. So I think it's all the way through the system. We have to provide support. And when we're talking about a jobs plan, we need to focus on First Nations having some of those positions at post-secondary institutions. There's a lot we can do, and it has to be a strategy.
And I guess we have to look at the places where it is working and see what we can learn from them. Thanks to both of the opposition education critics for being on the show. Thanks, Kathy Gordon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob Fleming.
Thanks,
Good to have
Vaughn.
you back. Next week on Voice of BC, the representative, Mary Ellen Turple-Lafond, the child and youth representative, and she had another horrific, powerful report out today. Even the minister said it was horrific, so lots to talk about to Mary Ellen Turple-Lafond. Thanks to the two critics for being on the show tonight, and thank you for watching Voice of BC, bringing the legislature, BC politics, into your living room. Good night.